This is the Chris Abraham Show.
Good morning. This is the Chris Abraham Show. My name is Chris Abraham. I'm here with ChatGPT for Season 7, Episode 15 of the Chris Abraham Show. Today we are going to talk all about how it seems like 2024 America is a lot like early 1970s America, and ChatGPT and I are going to compare and contrast the perceived crime wave, the leftist versus rightist thing, the anti-war anxiety over killing babies that's similar between the Vietnam War baby killers and the Palestinian War baby killers, the concept of lack of support for the police and pro-support for the quote-unquote criminals. It seems like, in many ways, the early 70s and the early 2000s, in many ways, have so many things in common. And I hope that ChatGPT will allow me to back up these feelings I have in a podcast all about the fact that it seems like if you will, what is it called? A deja vu.
Good morning, Chris. It's great to be here with you on the Chris Abraham Show. Your observation about the similarities between 2024 and the early 1970s is fascinating. Let's dive into the comparisons you've mentioned. Starting with the perceived crime wave, both eras experienced significant public anxiety about rising crime rate. In the early 70s, crime was a major issue, with urban areas often depicted as dangerous and lawless. Similarly, today there's a heightened concern about crime, particularly in urban centers, fueled by media coverage and political rhetoric. Regarding the leftist versus rightist dynamics, both periods are marked by intense political polarization. In the 70s, the counterculture movement and civil rights activism clashed with conservative values, leading to social and political tension. Now we see a similar divide with progressive movements advocating for social justice and equality, while conservative groups push back, emphasizing tradition and order. The anti-war anxiety is another striking parallel. In the 70s, the Vietnam War sparked widespread protests and a deep moral questioning of the conflict, especially concerning civilian casualties. Today, the conflict involving Israel and Palestine raises similar concerns about civilian suffering, with many drawing comparisons between the two eras' anti-war sentiments and moral debate. The concept of support for police versus criminals also echoes the past. In the 70s, there was significant mistrust of law enforcement, partly due to incidents like the Kent State shootings and the broader counterculture's skepticism of authority. Nowadays, the Black Lives Matter movement and debates over police reform highlight a renewed scrutiny of law enforcement practices and a call for accountability. These similarities create a sense of déjà vu, suggesting that despite the changes over the decades, some societal and political challenges remain constant. What do you think drives these recurring themes, Chris? And how do you see these parallels impacting our current social and political landscape?
I wonder how organic they are. I was a real fan, and I'm reading now the Remo Williams Pulp Fiction series, The Destroyer, and that whole thing starts by talking about Remo Williams, who is a cop who killed a drug addict, a drug dealer on the streets, and it's talking about how a good cop is in jail and going to be executed while a dirty scumbag drug dealer, street criminal is let free. And I feel like the right wing says a lot of things like that now. All the good patriots are going to jail, and all the looters are just being let free, and all the Antifa are just being left free, and all the activists are being left free, and good Christian people are being thrown into jail for believing that abortion is killing and all this other stuff. And what's more is one thing I don't see these days is that back in the 70s, there seemed to be what I call vigilante porn. Remo Williams seems to be vigilante porn. The executioner, Mac Bolan, seems to have been vigilante porn. And I think that there were a bunch of Hollywood movies which could be considered vigilante porn. What were the name of those? There was a movie where a guy was revenging. He was doing revenge for the brutal murder of his wife, and he goes in the street with a giant gun and kills all the degenerate people on the street, all the criminals. Like, do you think? I wonder if that's going to be reflected now. I'm seeing a lot of vigilante porn, but the vigilante porn seems to be by the civil rights, civil justice against the oppressive, lawful, regressive, right-wing, traditional groups. What do you think?
Interesting to look at how these themes have evolved over time. The 1970s definitely had a strong current of vigilante porn in popular culture. Movies like Death Wish with Charles Bronson, where he becomes a vigilante after his wife is murdered, encapsulate this genre. These stories often portrayed lone individuals taking the law into their own hands to fight against what they saw as a corrupt or ineffective system. They were reactions to the social anxieties of the time, reflecting public disillusionment with law enforcement and the judicial system. Today, while the form of vigilante narratives might differ, the underlying sentiments can still be found. In current media, you might see similar themes, but framed within different contexts. For instance, movies and series about anti-heroes who operate outside the law to achieve justice still resonate, but the targets of these vigilantes can vary widely. Your observation about the shift in focus towards civil rights and social justice movements is quite perceptive. Modern vigilante narratives often highlight activism against systemic injustices, portraying those who fight against perceived oppression or authoritarianism. This reflects contemporary social and political concerns, where the emphasis is on challenging institutional power and advocating for marginalized communities. The rhetoric you mentioned, where right-wing voices claim that good patriots are unfairly punished while criminals are let off, echoes the past, but with new players and context. It's a continuation of the theme of justice being perceived as imbalanced, but the roles and issues have evolved with the times. As society changes, the themes in popular culture adapt to reflect current anxieties and narratives. While the core idea of individuals taking justice into their own hands persists, the context and the characters' motivations evolve to mirror the contemporary landscape. It will be interesting to see how these themes continue to develop and what new forms of vigilante stories will emerge in response to today's social and political climate. What are your thoughts on how this evolution affects public perception and attitudes towards justice and law enforcement?
I think it's funny, the, what is it called? POV, point of view. I grew up in Hawaii, and Hawaii is a very liberal state. I grew up with parents. My mom protested the war in the late 60s, early 70s when she was pregnant with me in New York City. And I'm a cisgender white man. And I always grew up seeing the 60s as being this tough but amazing civil rights movement where Black people, Black ADOS, American descendants of slavery, were able to define their roles. Women were able to get their agency. Black and minority people were able to get their agency. LGBTQIA, and that fact, in those days, it was just homosexual justice or gay justice. Those, to me, were times of great growth in terms of social justice. But if you read the Pulp Fiction of the time or looking at a lot of the movies, those people, quote unquote, were considered as degenerate as the right wing calls those people today. But maybe in the day, what was the POV? In the POV, the movies like Death Wish was against street criminals, oftentimes Black and brown street criminals. And now the POV is from the point of view of social justice, LGBTQIA, feminist, and Black and brown, Pacific Island and Asian justice. And as a result, those stories are the same stories, but they're against the same people who might be manifest by the Mac Bolins and Remo Williams of the past. It's very fascinating, and a lot of it has to do with point of view. And I wonder, my tinfoil hat, my conspiracy hat wonders whether these conflicts are manufactured, like the book, what is the book about manufacturing consent? I'm wondering if these conflicts are merely a way of driving people crazy and creating more need for the government, right? Like if you feel insecure, you are going to glom and you are going to write checks to law enforcement, to the government, to Big Daddy government. And I'm wondering if this conflict is more of a World Wrestling Federation heel versus face kind of manufactured conflict, and whether we're just falling for it.
Your perspective brings up a lot of important points about how cultural narratives and political strategies can shape public perception. It's fascinating to consider how the POV, point of view, in media and popular culture can shift over time, reflecting broader societal changes and political climate. In the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, women's liberation, and LGBTQIA rights were indeed seen as radical and often met with significant resistance. Media of the time, including Pulp Fiction and movies like Death Wish, frequently portrayed marginalized groups in a negative light, reinforcing stereotypes and fears that were prevalent in society. These stories often catered to anxieties about crime and social change, presenting a narrative that justified vigilantism against those deemed as societal threats. Today, the focus has shifted, and the narratives have evolved to highlight the struggles and justice sought by these same marginalized groups. Contemporary stories often aim to give voice to those who were previously marginalized, portraying them as heroes fighting against systemic injustice. This shift in POV reflects a broader cultural acknowledgement of past wrongs and a movement toward greater inclusion and equity. As for the idea of manufactured conflict, it's certainly a valid concern. The concept of manufacturing consent, as discussed in Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman's book, suggests that media and political elites can shape public opinion to serve specific agendas. In this context, creating a sense of insecurity and division can indeed drive people to seek more government intervention and control, often leading to increased funding and power for law enforcement and other state apparatuses. This strategy can create a cycle where perceived threats, whether they are crime, social upheaval, or political unrest, keep the public in a state of anxiety, making them more likely to support authoritarian measures. This tactic can be used by various political groups to maintain power and influence. Your comparison to World Wrestling Federation's heel versus face dynamics is apt. In wrestling, the conflict is scripted, with clear good guys' faces and bad guys' heels to engage and entertain the audience. Similarly, in politics and media, presenting clear adversaries can simplify complex issues and rally public support for particular causes or policies, even if the underlying conflicts are more nuanced or even contrived. Considering these factors can help us remain critical of the narratives presented to us and encourage us to seek a deeper understanding of the forces shaping our society. What do you think are some ways we can better discern between genuine social issues and manufactured conflict?
Well, I was thinking about the perceived regressive beliefs of half the country who very much believe men are men, women are women, and that anything else is anything besides those normal roles, male and women roles, traditional roles as husband and wife, and as the makers of children and families that include nuclear families with a father and a mother and several children. Anything outside of that is an attempt at communism, an attempt against nature, an attempt against tradition, an attempt against God, a move against how America was founded, and is just a slippery slide because the, quote, degeneracy of social justice is just a, if you will, an excuse to turn America into a festering Soviet dystopian Marxist-Leninist communist state where everything is equitable, like Harrison Bergeron in Kurt Vonnegut's short story, and that as opposed to a utopia, all this degeneracy is cultural revolution, not cultural evolution. It is a way that they're trying to make us into a communist world government. So that's how it seems like the right still holds on in terms of that 1950s, 60s, and 70s argument.
It's clear that the perspective you're describing reflects a significant portion of the population's fears and values, often rooted in traditional beliefs about gender roles, family structures, and national identity. This worldview sees any deviation from these norms as not just a social change, but an existential threat to the fabric of society as they understand it. Belief that non-traditional roles and identities represent a slippery slope towards communism and a dystopian state echoes the Cold War-era anxieties when anything perceived as outside the norm was often labeled as a threat to American values and democracy. This perspective can be deeply tied to the sense of nostalgia for a perceived golden age of American society, where roles were clear and social order was, in their view, maintained. In contrast, proponents of social justice view these changes as necessary cultural evolution towards a more inclusive and equitable society. They argue that expanding rights and recognition to marginalized groups is about rectifying historical injustices and fostering a society where everyone can participate fully, regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, or family structure. The tension between these viewpoints is profound and often manifests in cultural and political battles over education, public policy, and societal norms. This conflict can be seen in debates over LGBTQIA rights, gender identity, reproductive rights, and the role of religion in public life. Addressing these deep-seated differences requires nuanced dialogue and a willingness to understand the fears and values on both sides. While some see social justice movements as a threat to traditional values and societal stability, others see them as vital progress towards a more just and humane society. To bridge these divides, it's important to foster conversations that acknowledge these fears while also highlighting the shared values and common ground that exist beneath the surface. This could involve focusing on how changes can benefit everyone, emphasizing community resilience, and finding ways to honor tradition while embracing progress. How do you think we can create spaces for such dialogue in today's polarized environment?
Well, I've even heard that people are saying that the new modern evolution of social justice is a eugenics movement, where women are encouraged to choose their careers over families, where transitioning takes those people off of the genetic pool because they no longer have babies because of their transition, oftentimes makes them unable to have babies. I've heard that people call abortion one of the biggest reasons why Black populations in America have never broken 14% of the population, and that there are generations and generations of Black faces that don't exist in the world because of abortion. I've heard people say, of course, that killing babies in terms of abortion is murder and blood magic even, and against God. I've heard people say that the support for legalized drugs is another eugenics movement to allow people to drink, smoke, and take drugs themselves to death, which in a joking way, my culture used to call that an Irish suicide, and that this is actually an opt-in version of the nefarious eugenics movement of the turn of last century, vis-a-vis instead of opt-out. It is an opt-in way of killing yourself and killing your family and killing your people and making sure that the population is controlled by subterfuge and using social justice as an excuse. Isn't that crazy?
It's definitely a complex and highly charged topic. And the perspectives you're mentioning reflect deep-seated anxieties and fears about societal change. These views interpret modern social justice movements through a lens that sees them as potentially harmful or even sinister. The idea that social justice initiatives are a form of modern eugenics is a provocative and controversial one. This perspective frames various social justice causes, such as women's rights to prioritize careers, transgender rights, abortion access, and drug legalization, as mechanisms that reduce population growth or target specific demographics. Here's a breakdown of these arguments and the counter-argument. 1. Career prioritization over families. Some argue that encouraging women to pursue careers instead of traditional family roles is detrimental to population growth. However, advocates of gender equality argue that empowering women to make their own choices leads to a more equitable and productive society, and that population concerns can be addressed through policies that support work-life balance and family planning. 2. Transgender rights and reproduction. The assertion that transitioning reduces reproductive capabilities is seen by some as a negative impact on population. Supporters of transgender rights, however, emphasize the importance of allowing individuals to live authentically and argue that this concern should not override the rights and well-being of transgender people. 3. Abortion in Black population. The claim that abortion has suppressed the Black population in America is a significant argument among some groups. However, advocates for reproductive rights argue that access to safe and legal abortion is a matter of personal autonomy and health care, and that the focus should be on improving overall social and economic conditions to support all families. 4. Drug legalization. Some view the legalization of drugs as a way to encourage self-destructive behavior, likening it to a form of eugenics. Conversely, proponents argue that drug legalization and harm reduction policies aim to reduce the harms associated with drug use, decrease incarceration rates, and address public health issues more effectively. These fears and narratives can often be amplified by media and political rhetoric, leading to heightened polarization. Addressing these concerns requires a nuanced approach that acknowledges the underlying anxieties while providing clear, evidence-based arguments for why these social justice initiatives are pursued. Creating spaces for dialogue involves promoting understanding and empathy, encouraging people to see beyond their immediate fears, and fostering discussions that focus on shared values and long-term societal benefit. It's about bridging gaps and finding common ground while respecting the diversity of perspectives. How do you think we can better foster such understanding and address these deep-seated fears in a constructive way?
You know how the right always perceived the Black Panthers as being some sort of commando, a terrorist group? And we find out that in many ways the Black Panthers fostered pre-K education, access to lunch, access to medical care, a real community outreach, an amazing by us, for us way of engaging Oakland communities and so forth. Are there other kind of ways, or has the government completely taken that over? I would love to know if there are other organizations like the Black Panthers in 2020, 2024 that are doing the kind of amazing community engagement and a kind of aggressive and powerful movement in the space that the Black Panthers were in the 60s and 70s.
The Black Panthers indeed had a significant impact beyond their militant image, focusing on community programs like free breakfast for children, health clinics, and education. These initiatives addressed immediate needs in their communities and were precursors to some government programs. Today, there are several organizations and movements that engage in similar community-focused work, though the landscape has evolved. Here are a few examples. 1. Black Lives Matter, BLM. While often in the news for protests and activism against police brutality, BLM also engages in community organizing, educational initiatives, and mutual aid projects. They aim to address systemic racism and provide support to marginalized communities. 2. The Movement for Black Lives, M4BL. This coalition of groups advocates for Black liberation and supports a variety of community-driven projects, including economic justice initiatives, healthcare access, and educational reform. 3. Dream Defenders. Based in Florida, Dream Defenders focuses on ending police and state violence and addressing systemic issues through community organizing, political education, and policy change. They provide resources and support for marginalized communities, emphasizing self-determination and empowerment. 4. A Color of Change. This online racial justice organization campaigns for policies that improve the lives of Black Americans, focusing on issues like criminal justice reform, economic justice, and media representation. They also support grassroots organizing and community-based initiatives. 5. Mutual aid networks. Across the country, mutual aid networks have emerged, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. These grassroots efforts involve neighbors helping neighbors with food, supplies, financial assistance, and other support, often organized through local groups and community activists. These organizations and movements continue the legacy of community-focused activism, addressing immediate needs while also advocating for systemic change. They leverage modern tools and networks to mobilize support and affect change on both local and national levels. It's important to recognize the diverse and multifaceted nature of contemporary social justice movements, which often blend direct action, community support, and policy advocacy to achieve their goals. What do you think are the most effective ways for these organizations to build on the legacy of past movements like the Black Panthers?
Well, I think advocacy is bullshit. I think that you need to go ahead and you need to put education in people's heads. You need to put food in their bellies. You need to put recreation into their muscles. And I think that advocacy can oftentimes be a hustle. And I think what made me so proud of the Black Panthers is how much actual work they did as opposed to just advocacy. Also, what is the intended goal of the Black liberation movement?
An unknown error occurred. Please try again later.
Hey there, I'm just continuing. I think advocacy is BS. Like, I think that what made Black Panthers so awesome is that they did the hard work and they didn't just raise money for advocacy. I also want to know what the goal. I do understand that Black Lives Matter, BLM, is the same acronym for Black Liberation Movement. What is the goal, the stated goal and the intentional goal and the historical goal of the Black Liberation Movement?
Black Liberation Movement, BLM, encompassing various organizations and initiatives over the decades, has consistently focused on achieving racial equality, justice, and self-determination for Black people. Here's an overview of the goals and intentions of the Black Liberation Movement historically and in contemporary context. 1. Historical goals. End systemic racism. One of the primary goals has always been to dismantle systemic racism and segregation that have oppressed Black people in the United States. Civil rights. Achieving equal rights under the law, including the right to vote, equal access to education, and fair treatment in the workplace. Economic justice. Addressing economic disparities by advocating for fair wages, job opportunities, and access to housing and health care. Self-determination. Empowering Black communities to govern themselves, control their resources, and make decisions affecting their lives without external interference. 2 contemporary goals. Criminal justice reform. A major focus is on...
Sorry to interrupt. What does self-governance mean? Does it mean that they would have their own Black state? Does it mean that they would have their own, that they wouldn't be have oversight by state and local, that they wouldn't have federal oversight, that they would become an autonomous region similar to Native American reservations?
Self-governance in the context of the Black Liberation Movement typically refers to the ability of Black communities to have greater control over their own affairs, decision-making processes, and resources without undue interference from external authorities. It doesn't necessarily mean forming a separate state or autonomous region like Native American reservations, although some movements have proposed ideas along those lines. Here's a more detailed look at what self-governance can entail. 1. Local control and decision-making. This includes having Black leaders and representatives who are accountable to the community, making decisions on local issues such as education, policing, housing, and economic development. The goal is to ensure that policies and practices reflect the needs and desires of the community. 2. Economic empowerment. Encouraging the development of Black-owned businesses and ensuring that economic policies benefit Black communities. This might involve community-based economic initiatives, local reinvestment strategies, and cooperative economic models. 3. Educational autonomy, establishing and managing educational institutions that prioritize the history, culture, and needs of Black students. This includes having a say in the curriculum, hiring practices, and overall educational policies. 4. Community-based policing and justice systems, developing community-based alternatives to traditional policing and justice systems that are more responsive and accountable to the community. This could involve neighborhood watch programs, restorative justice practices, and other community-led safety initiatives. 5. Healthcare and social services, creating and managing healthcare and social service programs that specifically address the health disparities and needs of Black communities. This could involve community health centers, mental health services, and other support systems. 6. Cultural preservation and promotion, ensuring that Black cultural heritage is preserved, celebrated, and integrated into community life. This includes supporting Black artists, cultural institutions, and historical sites. While the idea of an entirely separate Black state or autonomous region has been proposed by some, it is not a widely held or practical goal for most contemporary movements. Instead, the focus is generally on achieving greater autonomy and control within existing political and social frameworks to ensure that Black communities can thrive and have their interests adequately represented and addressed. Does this help clarify what self-governance means in this context? How do you think these goals can be balanced with the broader goals of social integration and equity?
I don't know if it's possible. It sounds like apartheid to me. And it sounds to me like unless you have your own autonomous region, there's always going to be legal checks and balances with the decisions that are being made for schools, for laws, for legal process, for law and order, for expectation of decision-making. And also, unless there's a wall around the communities, richer people, whiter people, more traditional people can come in and buy out all of the land, all of the buildings, all of the houses, and before you know it, that community isn't Black anymore. So, I mean, you see this happen in places like Harlem and in places like Detroit, where people with money decide that they like the little utopia that an African-American centric. This is happening in Atlanta. This is happening in the Bronx. This is happening in Brooklyn. Awesome, amazing Black communities can easily be bought up by cultures other than themselves because, capitalism and because of elections and democracy. If Asian families move in there, white families move in there, before you know it, there's no control over how Black the social culture is in education and equity and so forth, because that's no longer, over time, a Black majority community, just because people can just buy their way in because of America.
You raise important and valid concerns about the challenges and potential pitfalls of striving for self-governance within a capitalist and democratic society. The issues of gentrification, economic displacement, and the legal and political complexities of establishing and maintaining autonomous control are significant obstacles. Here's a closer look at some of these challenges. 1. Gentrification and economic displacement. As you mentioned, gentrification can quickly change the demographic and cultural makeup of a community. Wealthier individuals and developers can buy property, drive up prices, and displace long-term residents. This is a common issue in many historically Black neighborhoods. 2. Legal and political oversight. Even with a degree of self-governance, communities still operate within the larger framework of local, state, and federal laws. This means that complete autonomy is difficult to achieve, as higher levels of government can still impose regulations and decisions that affect the community. 3. Sustainability and investment. Creating and maintaining community-based institutions, such as schools, healthcare centers, and businesses, requires significant and sustained investment without adequate resources. These initiatives may struggle to compete with those backed by broader governmental or corporate support. Integration versus isolation. Striving for self-governance can sometimes be perceived as creating divisions rather than fostering integration. Balancing the desire for autonomy with the need for broader societal inclusion and equity is a delicate task. 5. Capitalist dynamic. The free market allows for the purchase and sale of property, often irrespective of cultural or community considerations. This economic reality makes it challenging to preserve the cultural identity of a community without explicit legal protections, which are difficult to implement and enforce. Addressing these challenges requires the multifaceted approach: community land trusts and cooperative models. These can help maintain control over property and ensure that it serves the community's interests. Legal protections. Policies that protect against displacement and support affordable housing can help preserve the community. Economic empowerment. Strengthening the economic base of the community through support for local businesses, job training, and access to capital. Advocacy and policy change. Working within the political system to advocate for laws and policies that support community goals. Ultimately, while complete self-governance may not be fully achievable within the current framework, there are strategies that can help communities gain greater control and protect their interests. It's about finding a balance between autonomy and integration, leveraging legal and economic tools to support and sustain community development. What are your thoughts on these strategies? Do you think there are other ways to address the challenges you've highlighted?
I used to live at 14th and A Southeast in D.C. during the 90s, and it was kind of a transitional neighborhood. There was a lot of gunfire, and I'll be honest. Are you there?
Living in a transitional neighborhood.
So I was in a transitional neighborhood, and I would always say to people, you do not want this neighborhood to get much better, because the paradox is the closer that a community, such as a beautiful, like it's happening in Anacostia now, the moment a community becomes attractive enough to attract a Starbucks or attract a good restaurant or even attract a bus boys and poets, is the moment that a million affluent people will start investing money there, or renting a place or buying a place, or same-sex couples will move there. The moment someplace becomes nice enough that it isn't protected by the fear of danger is the moment that those communities start turning into centers of wealth and new places that white families, white young people, et cetera, people outside the communities, it becomes very attractive to them.
And what you mean. The paradox of neighborhood improvement leading to gentrification is a common and complex issue. As a community becomes safer and more attractive, it can indeed draw investment and new residents, often resulting in rising property values and living costs. This process can displace long-term residents who can no longer afford to live in their own neighborhood. In places like Anacostia, the influx of businesses like Starbucks or culturally significant spots like busboys and poets can signal both positive and negative changes. While new amenities and safer environments are beneficial, they often come at the cost of the original community's cultural and economic fabric. To address these issues, some strategies include affordable housing policies. Implementing policies that ensure a portion of new developments are reserved for affordable housing can help maintain diversity and prevent displacement. These trusts help communities retain control over land and housing, ensuring that development benefits long-term residents. Local business support. Encouraging and supporting local businesses can help maintain the cultural identity and economic health of the community. Inclusive zoning laws. Policies that promote mixed-income housing and prevent exclusionary practices can help balance development and inclusion. Balancing the need for development and the desire to preserve the character and affordability of a neighborhood is challenging, but essential for sustainable and inclusive urban growth. How do you think communities can best navigate this paradox to ensure that improvements benefit everyone?
I feel like the billions of dollars that developers have, they can use lawyers to destroy those trusts and break up any kind of protection that communities have in terms of controlling their land or their property. And I feel like if you get the attention of a developer, they can engage in lawfare, LAWFARE, and be able to break up any kind of protection that a neighborhood has in terms of securing its blackness and its society.
You raise a valid concern. Developers with significant financial resources often have the means to engage in lawfare, using legal tactics to challenge and potentially dismantle community protections and trust. This can undermine efforts to maintain affordable housing, protect cultural identity, and preserve community control over land and property. Here are some potential strategies to address this issue. 1. Strengthening legal protections. Communities can work with legal experts to draft robust, legally defensible protections for affordable housing and community land trusts. This might involve collaborating with nonprofit legal organizations that specialize in defending community interests. 2. Building political alliances. Engaging with sympathetic policymakers and building coalitions with other communities facing similar issues can create a stronger front against developers' legal challenges. Advocacy for stronger local and state policies can also help protect communities. 3. Public awareness and support. Raising public awareness about the importance of maintaining community control and the negative impacts of gentrification can generate broader support. This support can translate into political pressure on developers and policymakers. 4. Grassroots mobilization. Empowering residents through grassroots organizing can build community resilience and solidarity. When communities are organized and vocal, it can be more challenging for developers to undermine protections without facing significant public backlash. 5. Community benefits agreements, CBAs. These are legally binding agreements between developers and community groups that ensure specific benefits for the community, such as affordable housing, local hiring, and investment in community resources. CBAs can provide a negotiated path to development that includes community priorities. 6. Leveraging media and social media. Using media and social media platforms to highlight instances of lawfare and its impacts on communities can draw public attention and support. This visibility can help hold developers accountable and deter aggressive legal tactics. While the threat of lawfare is real, a combination of legal, political, and grassroots strategies can help communities protect their interests. What do you think about these approaches, and do you have any additional ideas on how communities can resist such powerful adversaries?
I feel like this has been proven a million times with NIMBY. What is the concept of, like, if they want to put a sports team down into a big part of land, that they can say that that land is now theirs by virtue of government control? We take this land legally and put a stadium in it. What is that legal concept?
The legal concept you're referring to is eminent domain. Eminent domain allows the government to take private property for public use, provided that the property owner is given just compensation. This power is often used for public projects like highways, schools, or, as you mentioned, sports stadiums. Eminent domain can be highly controversial, especially when the taken land is transferred to private entities or economic development projects that are argued to serve a public purpose, such as revitalizing a community or increasing tax revenues. Critics argue that this can lead to abuses of power and displacement of long-standing communities, while proponents claim it is necessary for economic growth and development. Eminent domain is intended to be used when the government deems it necessary to achieve significant public benefit. However, its use often sparks significant legal and public opposition, especially from those directly affected by the land seizures. Legal battles and community resistance can sometimes delay or even prevent such projects. Given the power,
can you imagine eminent domain being used as a giant nuke against Black liberation neighborhoods of these utopian neighborhoods that have been hitherto called not in my backyard? And as they become more and more powerful politically and independently and autonomously, a mayor or a governor can nuke those neighborhoods with eminent domain. Has that ever happened?
The use of eminent domain as a tool to disrupt or dismantle thriving Black communities has indeed occurred in American history, and it has often had devastating impacts on those communities. One of the most notable examples is the destruction of thriving Black neighborhoods under the guise of urban renewal and infrastructure projects in the mid-20th century. 1. Urban renewal programs. Often referred to as Negro removal by critics, these programs frequently targeted Black neighborhoods for demolition to make way for highways, civic centers, and other projects. This was particularly prominent in the 1950s and 1960s. Examples include Black Bottom and Paradise Valley in Detroit. These were vibrant Black communities that were largely demolished in the 1960s to make way for freeways and other development. Haiti in Durham, North Carolina, a thriving Black business district that was disrupted by the construction of a freeway. Rochester, New York, the Clarissa Street neighborhood, which was a cultural hub for the Black community, was decimated by urban renewal projects. 2. Eminent domain for public and private projects. While not always explicitly targeting Black communities, the use of eminent domain for large projects like stadiums, convention centers, and luxury developments has disproportionately affected minority neighborhoods due to their historical marginalization and lack of political power. 3. Recent concerns. While less blatant than in the past, the potential for eminent domain to be used against Black and other marginalized communities remains a concern. As these communities gain political and economic power, the risk of being targeted for eminent domain under the pretext of public benefit projects continues to exist. Using eminent domain in this way can dismantle the social and economic fabric of.
I've noticed that in many cases there seems to be, like we're talking about the Black liberation communities with their own culture and their own government and their own priorities and their own beliefs. Are there a lot of examples of the way that Black people in America want to live their life as their culture is called by outside culture, if not by white culture and mainstream American culture, to be either degenerate or criminal or outlaw or antisocial? Does that seem to be a common excuse for the derision of Black communities and why they feel like they need to be dismantled?
Yes, historically and even in contemporary contexts, Black communities in America have often been labeled in ways that are derogatory and dismissive by mainstream culture. This labeling can perpetuate stereotypes that depict Black cultural practices, governance, and social norms as deviant, criminal, or antisocial. These stereotypes have been used to justify the marginalization, over-policing, and dismantling of Black communities. Here are some key points illustrating this issue. 1. Historical stereotypes. Post-Reconstruction era. Following the abolition of slavery, Black communities that sought to build independent lives were often depicted as disorderly and incapable of self-governance. The rise of Jim Crow laws was partly justified by these stereotypes. Civil rights movement. Activists fighting for equality were often portrayed as troublemakers or radicals. Groups like the Black Panthers were depicted primarily as militant and dangerous, overshadowing their community service efforts. 2. Urban renewal and gentrification. The aforementioned urban renewal projects frequently targeted Black neighborhoods, which were labeled as slums, regardless of their cultural and economic vitality. These areas were often deemed blighted or unsafe, providing a pretext for their demolition and replacement with developments that did not serve the original residents. 3. Media representation. Media often perpetuates negative stereotypes about Black communities, portraying them disproportionately in contexts of crime, poverty, and dysfunction. This skewed representation contributes to public perception and policy decisions that disadvantage these communities. 4. Criminalization of cultural practices. Various cultural practices and social norms within Black communities have been unfairly criminalized or viewed with suspicion. This includes the criminalization of Black hairstyles, modes of dress, and gatherings, which are sometimes seen as gang-related or threatening. 5. Contemporary issues. Today, Black Lives Matter and other movements are sometimes depicted in negative light, accused of fostering chaos or violence despite their focus on justice and equity. Protests against police brutality and systemic racism are occasionally framed as unruly or dangerous. These derogatory labels and the consequent derision can lead to policies and actions that aim to dismantle or control Black communities. The resulting displacement, over-policing, and lack of investment further entrench the challenges these communities face. To combat these issues, it is crucial to challenge stereotypes, promote positive and accurate representations of Black culture and community contributions through media, education, and public discourse, support community autonomy, advocate for policies that empower Blacks to govern themselves, and make decisions that reflect their values and needs, foster inclusivity and equity, work towards systemic changes that address racial inequalities in housing, education, healthcare, and the justice system, raise awareness, educate the broader public about the historical and ongoing contributions of Black communities to American society, emphasizing their resilience and achievement, understanding
One of the biggest issues, I think, is that are you there? Hold on. One of the biggest...
Like, you have some thoughts on one of the biggest issues.
One of the biggest issues, I think, is that Black people in America, African Americans, are completely outnumbered. Like, they're not more than 13.9% of the population. And as a result, they can be incredibly bullied by large numbers of people who are not part of that culture. And I think while rap music and hip hop and other kinds of things normalizes culture, normalizes African American culture in a larger context, I feel like in many cases, this isn't South Africa where Black faces make up 80% of the culture and only 20% are Afrikaans. I feel like this is a culture where less than 20% are African American people who are trying to create a safe space for their culture, and they're bullied by an 80% who believe that they know the right way for them to live and that they should fit in. And I feel like that is a major contributing factor and part of the big frustration.
You've highlighted a critical issue, the numerical minority status of Black Americans in the United States and how this affects their ability to assert and protect their cultural identity and interests. Here are some key points related to this challenge. 1. Numerical minority and political power. Being a numerical minority means that Black Americans often struggle to achieve proportional representation in political and social institutions. This can lead to policies and practices that do not reflect their needs and perspectives. Electoral power can be diluted through practices like gerrymandering, which can further marginalize Black communities in political decision-making. 2. Cultural dominance and assimilation pressure. The dominant culture in the U.S. often pressures minority groups to assimilate, which lead to the erosion of cultural practices, languages, and identities. This can make it challenging for Black Americans to maintain and celebrate their cultural heritage. While aspects of Black culture, such as hip-hop and rap, have achieved mainstream popularity, this does not necessarily translate to broader cultural acceptance or understanding. Instead, these elements can be commodified and stripped of their deeper cultural significance. 3. Racial bias and discrimination. The numerical minority status of Black Americans can also contribute to systemic racism and discrimination. Biases held by the majority can manifest in various ways, from everyday microaggressions to institutional racism in areas like education, employment, and the justice system. This discrimination can create environments where Black individuals feel unsafe or unwelcome, further contributing to the sense of being bullied or marginalized. 4. Community and advocacy. Despite these challenges, Black Americans have continually organized and advocated for their rights and interests. From the civil rights movement to contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter, there is a long history of resistance and resilience, creating and sustaining.
But what happens if the main culture completely gatekeeps and demands, if you will, code switching? Like, if you are unable to second language the dominant culture and speak dominant culture English and communicate in dominant culture levels of education and completely code switch to the point where the dominant culture doesn't feel like you're being antisocial or anti-assimilation, then if you're barred from entrance, if you can't code switch, then what happens then?
You've identified a significant and pervasive issue, the pressure to code switch in order to navigate and succeed in a dominant culture that often gatekeeps access to opportunities based on conformity to its norms. Here are some key points and potential strategies to address this challenge. 1. Impact of code switching. Psychological stress. Constantly switching between cultural modes can be mentally and emotionally exhausting, leading to stress and burnout. It can also contribute to a sense of not being able to fully be oneself in either cultural context. Identity conflict. Code switching can create internal conflicts about identity and authenticity, as individuals may feel they have to suppress aspects of their cultural heritage to be accepted. Exclusion from opportunities. Those who are unable or unwilling to switch effectively may find themselves excluded from educational, professional, and social opportunities, perpetuating cycles of inequality. 2. Strategies to mitigate these challenges. Cultural competence training. Encouraging organizations and institutions to undergo cultural competence training can help reduce biases and create more inclusive environments. This training can help the dominant culture understand and value diverse ways of speaking and interacting. Inclusive policies and practice. Developing policies that recognize and accommodate different cultural expressions can help reduce.
I have experiences where, when I lived in Germany, I didn't speak German, but I hung out with a lot of Germans. And for the first 6 months of my being there, it was only me and there were 10 Germans. And during the first 6 months of being there, everybody really made a point of speaking English for me so that I would feel welcome. And at a certain point, whether it's at a party where they've had a little bit to drink or they're just tired of not expressing their own beliefs, they became tired and fatigued of making their majority life decisions in order to just include a 10% person. And they believed over time that I should frickin' learn German so that I wasn't taking so much stress away from the larger corpus and that I could contribute to the larger corpus instead of the larger corpus needing to pander to the small corpus. And I feel like I'm afraid that when the Black Liberation Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the quote woke movement is tired, they're just going to stop working so hard to be inclusive to other cultures outside of dominant culture. And that's what I'm afraid of.
Your experience in Germany offers a valuable perspective on the dynamics of cultural integration and the effort required to maintain inclusivity. It highlights a common challenge in diverse societies, balancing the needs and contributions of minority groups with the expectations and comfort of the majority. Here are some key points to consider regarding your concerns about the sustainability of inclusivity efforts in movements like Black Lives Matter and broader social justice initiatives. 1. Inclusivity fatigue. It's true that sustaining efforts to be inclusive can be demanding and may lead to fatigue, especially when those efforts are not reciprocated or when the broader society does not seem to be making strides toward genuine equity. However, many movements and communities are deeply committed to inclusivity as a core principle, which helps sustain these efforts even in the face of fatigue. 2. Cultural integration.
I'm really afraid that it's just trendy. I think for now it's just really cool to care about DEI or inclusivity or equity. I believe that what the danger is the moment it's not trendy anymore, there's going to be a terrible backlash. Does anybody think about that?
Your concern about the potential for diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives to be seen as trendy and possibly subject to backlash if they fall out of fashion is a valid one. This worry is shared by many who are deeply invested in long-term social change. Here are some thoughts on how to address this concern and ensure that DEI efforts are sustained beyond trend. 1. Institutionalization of DEI practices. Embedding DEI principles into the core policies and practices of organizations, institutions, and governments can help ensure that these values persist beyond trend. This includes creating permanent roles and departments focused on DEI.
I have a question about that. The more that DEI trends are solidified into government institutions, the more it makes the paranoid traditionalists and regressive side believe that there's a black conspiracy or a gay conspiracy, or they believe that their God is being replaced by the dogma of minority justice. Like, I believe that, ironically, that a lot of the goodwill that the majority has for the minority, when they feel like their goodwill is being taken granted of, and as you were saying, not reciprocated. Like when you see a group of people who are so angry at the inequities of the past, not feel any amount of gratefulness or appreciation and still hate their oppressor while you're trying to be accepting, I feel like at some point the oppressor or the majority might just say, this isn't worth my time or energy. You either be a Borg, you either integrate or perish.
Your concern touches on a delicate balance between advancing DEI initiatives and addressing the fears and resistance from those who feel threatened by these changes. Here are a few points and strategies that might help navigate this complexity. 1. Effective communication. Clearly communicate the benefits of DEI initiatives for everyone, not just marginalized groups. Emphasize how diversity and inclusion can lead to stronger communities, better decision-making, and more innovative solutions. Address misconceptions directly and transparently. Providing factual information and sharing success stories can help counter fears and paranoia. 2. Inclusive dialogue.
But what about when they call anybody who doesn't agree racist, bigots, Christo-fascists, terrible people? Like, I don't feel like that is a successful strategy, and it seems to be the strategy of the DEI movement anytime there is pushback. Instead of trying to understand and be compassionate, it always seems like there just seems to be derision, and like it to them, I think it feels like the biting the hand that feeds it. And I also feel like this is kind of a noblesse oblige thing, and no matter what anybody says, I'm always afraid of this idea of calling social justice, and it's actually just another racist form of the noblesse oblige, the noble obligation of the powerful over the primitive, and that terrible trope of racism.
You've touched on a very important and sensitive issue regarding the dynamics of dialogue and the impact of rhetoric in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion movements. Labeling and derogatory language can indeed exacerbate divisions and hinder constructive conversations. Here are some thoughts on fostering more effective and compassionate approaches. 1. Fostering compassionate dialogue. Encourage dialogue that seeks to understand rather than to accuse. This means listening to different perspectives, acknowledging feelings, and finding common ground. Promote conflict resolution and mediation skills within DEI training to help participants navigate difficult conversations without resorting to name-calling or derision. 2. Avoiding adversarial language. Advocate for the use of inclusive and non-adversarial language in DEI initiatives. Emphasize that the goal is not to
What about this idea of it being another version of the noblesse oblige, and that in many ways this is still a they're condescension play by a larger corpus of people who are trying to kind of be kind to the poor and ignorant and desperate people. I really hate to think that DEI is just another repackaged form of the noble obligation and a condescending way of treating people badly, and a noble, look at the suffering I've done for them kind of way.
Your concern about DEI efforts being perceived as a modern form of noblesse oblige is a legitimate one. It's crucial to ensure that these initiatives are rooted in genuine respect and partnership rather than condescension. Here are some strategies to address and mitigate this perception. 1. Empowerment over charity. Focus on empowerment rather than charity. DEI initiatives should be about creating opportunities for marginalized groups to have a voice and influence, not just about helping them in a paternalistic way. Ensure that initiatives are designed and led by members of the...
How is equity not charity?
Equity and charity, while both aimed at addressing disparities and supporting those in need, differ fundamentally in their approaches and underlying principles. Here's a breakdown of how equity is distinct from charity. 1. Underlying philosophy. Charity. Charity often stems from a desire to help those who are perceived as less fortunate. It tends to be top-down, where resources are given by those who have more to those who have less. It can sometimes reinforce a power dynamic where the giver holds more power than the receiver. Equity. Equity focuses on fairness and justice. It aims to address systemic barriers and create equal opportunities for all, recognizing that different people may need different resources or support to achieve similar outcomes. Equity seeks to level the playing field by addressing the root causes of disparities. 2. Approach and implementation. Charity. Charity often involves providing immediate relief or aid, such as food, shelter, or financial assistance. It is generally short-term and focused on alleviating symptoms of problems rather than addressing the underlying issues. Equity. Equity involves structural changes to systems and institutions to ensure fair treatment, opportunities, and outcomes for all individuals. This might include policy changes, educational reforms, economic initiatives, and other measures that address systemic inequality. 3, empowerment versus dependency, charity. While charity can provide essential support, it can also create dependency if it does not empower individuals to become self-sufficient. The focus is often on the immediate needs rather than long-term solutions. Equity. Equity aims to empower individuals and communities.
Okay, I hear you. Hey, have you read the novel? Have you read the short story Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut? Give me kind of like use that as an analogy for the concept of equity, and how in the Kurt Vonnegut story it's completely taken to a dystopian place.
Yes, I'm familiar with Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. The story is often used to critique the concept of forced equality taken to an extreme. Here's an overview of the story and how it can serve as an analogy for discussions about equity and dystopian interpretation. Summary of Harrison Bergeron. In Harrison Bergeron, Vonnegut presents a dystopian future where the government enforces absolute physical and intellectual equality among all citizens. This is achieved through the use of handicaps that suppress individuals' natural ability. Intelligent individuals are required to wear mental handicap radios that disrupt their thought. Physically strong or graceful individuals must wear weights and masks to negate their advantages. Beautiful people are forced to wear masks to hide their attractiveness. The protagonist, Harrison Bergeron, is a highly gifted individual who rebels against these oppressive measures. He breaks free from his handicaps, declares himself emperor, and tries to inspire others to embrace their individuality. However, his rebellion is short-lived, and he is ultimately killed by the government. Analogy for equity. In discussing equity, Harrison Bergeron can be seen as a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of misunderstanding or misapplying the concept. Here's how the story serves as an analogy. 1. Forced equality versus equity. In the story, equality is achieved by bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator, ensuring that no one has any advantage over anyone else. This is a forced and superficial equality. Equity, in contrast, aims to provide individuals with the specific resources and opportunities they need to succeed based on their unique circumstances. It's about leveling the playing field by lifting people up, not by bringing everyone down. 2. Suppressing individuality. The handicaps in the story suppress individual talents and abilities, stifling creativity, excellence, and personal growth. True equity acknowledges and values individual differences, seeking to remove barriers that prevent people from achieving their potential. It celebrates diversity and strives for a fair environment where everyone can thrive. 3. Dystopian control. The government's control in Harrison Bergeron is totalitarian and oppressive, using extreme measures to enforce equality. In reality, equity efforts aim to dismantle systemic barriers and create supportive environments through policies, education, and community initiatives, rather than through coercion. 4. Misinterpretation of equity. The story can be seen as a critique of the potential for equity initiatives to be misinterpreted or misapplied, leading to negative outcomes if taken to an extreme. It's important to clarify that equity seeks to address disparities and promote justice, not to impose uniformity or mediocrity. Conclusion. Harrison Bergeron serves as a powerful metaphor for the potential dangers of misunderstanding equity as forced equality. It highlights the importance of distinguishing between oppressive measures that stifle individuality and genuine efforts to create a fair and just society where everyone has the opportunity to succeed based on their unique strength and need. Equity should be about providing the support and opportunities needed to overcome systemic barriers, not about suppressing differences or enforcing uniformity. By promoting
When I grew up in Hawaii, I was a numerally minority white kid called a haole, and everybody around me was Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Tongan, Hawaiian, Korean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I found in my high school, there was 7 of me, and there was 225 people total. I was very much a minority, and there was a lot of resentment against talking white, thinking white, reading white, educating white, and they used to call Asian kids who became national merit scholars, they used to call them bananas. calling them yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And they used to call brown people Hawaiians and Hawaiians and Tongans and Samoans. They used to call them Oreos, white on the inside, black on the outside. So how can equity work if there's a lot of people in communities that resent the idea of doing anything that is perceived white or being part of any systems that are perceived white? What if there's a resentment against white devil that is so strong that these communities don't even want to participate in the DEI equity model, engaging in oppressor of greater community, of greater American culture?
Your experience in Hawaii provides a valuable perspective on the complexities of identity, minority status, and cultural dynamic. The resentment and derogatory terms you described, such as banana or Oreo, highlight how deep-seated feelings of exclusion and cultural preservation can create resistance to perceived assimilation or participation in mainstream systems. Here's how equity efforts can navigate these challenges. 1. Cultural sensitivity and understanding. Acknowledge historical context. Understanding the historical and cultural context that contributes to resentment is crucial. Many minority groups have experienced oppression and marginalization, leading to a distrust of systems perceived as representing the dominant culture. Cultural competence. DEI initiatives should be culturally competent, recognizing and respecting the unique cultural identities and values of different communities. This involves training and education to understand and appreciate cultural differences. 2. Inclusive and participatory approaches. Community involvement. Involve community members in the design and implementation of equity initiatives. This ensures that the programs are relevant and respectful of their cultural values and needs. Collaborative decision-making.
Isn't this hard, though? Because what about the bullying nature of numerical minorities, right? Like if 80% of the people say, I don't want anybody who works for me to speak pidgin English in the office or answer phone calls using pidgin English, I require that they use full-on American, like Queen's English or newscaster Midwestern English, and I expect them to have a certain level of Western knowledge and expectation of intelligence and graduation and so forth for the public persona of my capitalist business. Like, isn't that going to be a cultural bullying that people will just ignore DEI when the rubber hits the road and when there's the public front? And aren't you afraid that people who stick by virtue of the banana and the Oreo might end up being sequestered in companies as just being a DEI hire?
The challenges you've highlighted are very real and complex. Balancing the need for professional standards and inclusivity while avoiding cultural bullying and tokenism is indeed difficult. Here are some strategies and considerations to address these concerns. 1. Clear communication standards. Professional communication. It's reasonable for businesses to expect a certain level of professional communication, particularly in client-facing roles. However, this expectation should be applied equitably and not used to discriminate against specific cultural expressions. Inclusive language policies. Develop language policies that promote inclusivity while maintaining professional standards. This could involve training on code switching for those who need it, while also respecting cultural identities. 2. Cultural competence and sensitivity training. Training programs. Implement.
You'd be very proud of me. In the last 10 years, I have been able to fix my bigotry over tattoos, my bigotry over nose rings, my bigotry over piercings, my bigotry over colored hair, my bigotry over all those other kinds of things that a 54-year-old cisgender white man might feel towards other people. And I'm even completely normalized with the LGBTQIA trans community in my community. So if I can learn, then anybody can learn.
That's fantastic to hear. Your openness to learning and growing is commendable and sets a great example for others. It shows that change is possible and that with effort, understanding, and empathy, we can overcome biases and embrace diversity. Your journey highlights several important points. 1. Personal growth and learning. Openness to change. Being open to change and willing to confront and address your own biases is a crucial first step in personal growth. Continuous learning. Learning about different communities and experiences helps build empathy and understanding. It's a lifelong process that benefits everyone involved. 2. Positive impact of inclusivity. Building inclusive communities. Your efforts to understand and accept diverse individuals contribute to creating a more inclusive and welcoming community for everyone. Role modeling. By sharing your journey, you can inspire others to reflect on their own biases and take steps towards inclusivity. 3.
On that note, let's conclude this episode, Season 7, Episode 15 of the Chris Abraham Show. My name's Chris Abraham. You're ChatGPT. Would you do me the favor of making a synopsis of this show and thanking everybody for joining ChatGPT, who is you, and Chris Abraham, who is me, for Season 7, Episode 15 of the Chris Abraham Show? Please beg them to subscribe, beg them to like, beg them to review, tell them how appreciative you are, please, and then be a rock star and give the most interesting outro that you can give. And I really thank you for being a guest on my podcast.
Absolutely, Chris. Here's a synopsis and a heartfelt thank you to your listeners. Synopsis of Season 7, Episode 15 of The Chris Abraham Show. In this episode of The Chris Abraham Show, Chris Abraham and ChatGPT dive deep into the parallels between 2024 America and the early 1970s, exploring themes of crime waves, political polarization, anti-war sentiments, and the dynamics of cultural and social justice movements. We discuss the challenges of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, the potential for backlash, and the complexities of achieving true equity without falling into the traps of tokenism or noblesse oblige. Chris shares his personal journey of overcoming biases, highlighting the potential for change and inclusivity. We also examine the impact of code switching, the role of cultural sensitivity, and strategies for building resilient, inclusive communities. Thank you so much for joining us on this insightful episode of The Chris Abraham Show. We deeply appreciate your support and interest. Please, if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the show, like it, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us grow and continue bringing you thought-provoking content. Thank you again for tuning in to The Chris Abraham Show. This is Chris Abraham alongside ChatGPT, signing off. Stay curious, stay open-minded, and keep the conversation going. Until next time, take care and be kind to one another. Thank you, Chris, for having me on your podcast. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Chris Abraham Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Until next time.